Welcome to another how-to video from Bugspray.com. In this video, I'm going to talk about tree boring pests. These are insects that bore into trees, maybe some large shrubs, and can cause damage through the bark, ultimately leading to the death of the tree. The scope of this video will not be to help you identify the species that you have, and the reason for that is simple. In all cases, treatment will be the same. So it doesn't matter if you have Ips beetles, emerald pine, ash borers, pine weevils, longhorns, really doesn't matter. Turpentine beetles, again, all of these species, they can cause damage underneath the bark. Some can get into the sapwood or ultimately even the heartwood. The bottom line is that if you have an active infestation, you're going to need to treat the exterior of the tree, and then you're going to need a systemic application. So we're going to get into those details. But before we do, we're going to clear up some misunderstandings and hopefully explain or set some guidelines for what you can expect and help you make some decisions about the trees that you have. If you're watching this video, you're probably interested in doing either a preventive treatment or a complete treatment on a tree that has activity. For prevention, the surface treating is almost always all you need to do. You can follow up with the systemic application as well. If you have current activity, surface treating for sure, and systemic for sure as well. And the reason for that is, again, some of these boring pests can get into the sapwood, into the heartwood of the tree, and only with a systemic will you have those areas protected. The exterior treating is just not going to be strong enough to get into those sections of the tree. The surface treating is repellent, and the good news is that if you're just treating for prevention, once a year is almost always good enough. If you have activity, we always recommend twice a year applications for the first year, and then after that, just following up with once a year applications. One of the other common questions we get is, do I need to remove the tree? I've been told that a tree which is infested is doomed. Ultimately, it's going to die, so I might as well just cut it out. Well, the reality is that you don't need to do that. In many cases, trees can rebound. Trees live a long time, and if you're seeing some graying out, if you're seeing some brown out, whether it's pine needles or foliage, does not mean that the tree is dead. Trees will react initially by showing that, but again, this is what happens when a tree is under stress. So insects attacking a tree is very normal during its course of a lifetime, but when it starts to get significant, the tree will react, and the first thing it's going to do is shut down its foliage. So you can see some browning out. Here are some guidelines to make a determination if a tree needs to be removed or not. Obviously, the first is, do you want to save the tree? Do you want to keep it? If you want to keep a tree, but you're unsure if you'll be able to save it, these numbers and these guidelines should help you make that decision. If you're seeing a tree that has holes and maybe some sap leaking out, or if you have some sawdust, these are signs that there's activity. But if you have green foliage, that tree is fine. You'll be able to do your treatments and knock out the problem. If you see a tree or have a tree that is experiencing 25 to 50% brown out after just a few months, you can save that tree. No need to cut it down. If you have a tree that's 100% browned out, and this has happened within the past year, you can still save that tree. We do feel, and experience shows from our customers who are doing the applications, that if you have a tree that's been grayed out or browned out for 2 years or more, it's probably going to be difficult, if not impossible, to bring it back. So a tree that's showing damage and even browning out for up to a year can still be saved. There's no need to get rid of this tree. And one of the fallacies or myths about tree removal is that for some reason, people believe if they yank a tree off a property that's infested, they're not going to have to worry about their other trees, but this is just not true. In fact, a tree that has activity is most likely dropping tree litter that contains pheromones and smells that are likely to attract more beetles or some type of borer to the area. So any other trees that are left behind will be vulnerable if you're not at least doing preventive maintenance on them. So even if you cut down the infested tree, you would be very smart to treat the trees you leave behind so they don't develop a problem. So with that being said, let's talk about what options you have. As stated before, for prevention, we want to do a surface treating, and the Maxxthor is the way to go for that. This product is very easy to use. It is oil-based, so that means that it will penetrate into the bark. It will certainly last several months per application. It's highly repellent, so when you get it on the bark of the trees, you can repel them or the pests from wanting to get into the trees. It will kill what's in the trees. And when you're doing your applications, you want to spray to the point of runoff. So we always recommend spraying as high as you can reach, whether you're using one of these garden hose sprayers that you see back here, or a pump sprayer, or our trombone sprayer that you'll see listed below this video. Reach up as high as you can. 10-20 feet is almost always enough. And we do get asked, well, what about the top half of the tree? In virtually all cases, trees that have just begun to have a problem will always have the problem on the lower half of the tree, and almost always in the lower 25%. So reach up as high as you can. And even if that's just 15 or 20 feet, that's fine. Spray to the point of runoff. With the Maxxthor, the mixture rate will be approximately 2.5 ounces into a sprayer like this to the 5-gallon line, and then adding water to fill it to that line. So you add 2.5 ounces of the Maxxthor, fill up the sprayer to here with water, hook it to your hose, and that's going to get you 5 gallons of spray. How much will 5 gallons cover? Well, obviously you could stand there in one spot and just spray a tree and use it all. But I use approximately 10 gallons. I add 5 ounces of the Maxxthor and fill it halfway, hook it to my hose, and I'm treating 6 significant trees with this. Now these are pretty big trees. These range from 2 feet wide to bigger. So they are pretty big, but I don't have any problems. And I like to treat them at least once a year. So that can give you an idea when we talk about coverage. If the trees are 10 inches or less, I could probably treat 10 to 15 trees of that size with that same amount of spray. So the general rule is something in that range of 1 gallon for a pretty big tree of mixed product, and the 2.5 ounces per 5 gallons of water is the rate I'm using for prevention. If I had a significant problem, I would almost always increase the rate, meaning that I would probably go to 1 ounce per gallon. So in that example, I would add 5 ounces of the Maxxthor and fill it to the 5-gallon line and do my application initially using 1 ounce per gallon. The same is true if I'm mixing up a solution for the trombone sprayer or a pump sprayer. So 1 ounce per gallon would be the amount there. As far as the surface treating goes, I typically will wear rubber gloves and probably some eye protection because I'm spraying up high. Other than that, I'm going to get out there in the yard and do my spraying in the spring, and that's pretty much it. Over the course of the year, I may treat a tree because I have leftover chemical from another application, so it may get a secondary or third dose. But in most cases, all I'm doing is the 1 year application in the spring, and then after I do my surface treating, I move on to the systemic treating. The systemic treating is a little different in that you're going to need to create some holes around the base of the tree. So for systemic treating, what you're going to do is get a 5-gallon bucket, and using 3 to 4 gallons in a 5-gallon bucket, you're going to at least add the Prothor. The Prothor is the insecticide. Now remember, I pointed out earlier that trees which have activity need to get both of these treatments done, and the insecticide part is a good thing to do when you're treating systemically, but at the same time, adding something like a fertilizer is a great idea because it requires no extra work. And the fertilizer can really help a tree. It can give it a little shot of energy and nutrients that it needs to heal itself up. Let me also point out that trees which have insects doing damage like this are prone to getting fungus, and many of these beetles and these tree borers can actually transmit a fungus to a tree so that it's getting the fungus directly from the beetles. Beetles are essentially the carrier or the vector that infests the tree. So adding a fungicide, not a bad idea. And we carry one main one that is good for systemic applications. I happen to use that for my turf as well. And typically the mixture that I'm using when I'm treating a tree is I will use 1 ounce of the Prothor for every 10 inches of tree width. I'm not talking about circumference, I'm talking about width. So if a tree is this wide, 10 inches wide, I'm going to add 1 ounce of the Prothor, I'm going to add 2 ounces of the liquid fertilizer, and 1 ounce of the fungicide to a bucket that has 3 to 4 gallons of water. And then I'm going to poke holes around the tree, and then I'm going to pour the mixture into those holes. So for all practical purposes, a tree that is approximately 10 inches wide, it would get 1 bucket with 3 to 4 gallons of water, and that would contain 1 ounce of the Prothor, 2 ounces of the fertilizer, and 1 ounce of the fungicide. If the tree is 20 inches or bigger, which my trees are, I typically use 2 buckets. Each bucket has that same mixture, and then sometimes even a little more. But generally, I'm right at around 2 buckets. That seems to be fine for my trees because they're so healthy. And I've actually cut back on the fertilizer, meaning that I'm only using 1 ounce now in the spring. And the reason why is because I have several oaks that I'm treating, and the fertilizer seems to be causing them to produce massive quantities of acorns, and it's been problematic. So they're benefiting, the trees are obviously benefiting from the fertilizer, but so much so that they're making a mess with the acorns. So I've cut back to just 1 ounce of this in my annual treatments. If the trees were infested with something, I would certainly be using 2 ounces. And if you're treating systemically, it's probably because you have a problem. So using 2 ounces in the bucket would be suggested. Now, where the holes are is not critical, but here's a good guideline. Generally speaking, you want to be at least 1 foot or 2 away from the trunk, maybe 3 feet, and inside the drip line. The drip line is how far out from the trunk the tree branches go. So in this example, let's assume that this is a tree, the Prothor, and off of the trunk you have this limb, and it's 10 feet long. You would want to come out at least 3 feet, but not further than 10 feet. So someplace around here would be ideal, probably 4 or 5 feet out. As far as the holes are concerned, everyone always asks how deep do they need to be, how wide. There's no size requirement. The goal of the hole is to allow the product you're pouring out to get into the ground. If the ground is flat and you pour the product out, it will probably trickle down, but it will probably also get filtered out at the top end of the soil. So having the holes is a huge advantage of getting the product deeper down into the ground where the roots are that are going to absorb the treatment. Now, adding holes can be done 3 ways at least. You just be creative. If you have a pickaxe, you can probably poke holes. Many people will use something like a railroad tie, and if you're doing this, I would recommend certainly 10 to 20 holes if I was pouring out 1 bucket of mixed material. Another thing you can use is a garden stake. This is a fairly long, heavy rod that has a point on one end, and you can drive this into the ground. A piece of rebar this size will work just as well. You want to get at least 1 foot, if not 1.5 to 2 feet down. That's a real big help as well. And then ultimately, if you've got a power tool and want to make some nice holes, the earth auger is a great device. I do use this on a few of the trees because of their position. They're on a slight hill, and I know that if I don't have a good hole, when I'm pouring product out, it will roll down the hill. So I'm not relying on small holes. I'm drilling out the soil there and pouring the product through those holes. The last thing that I want to mention regarding treatments is a direct quick kill aerosol application, which is not really required, and it's not something that's going to solve a problem. But if you have a pine tree or any tree that has a lot of gaps and you see a lot of holes where beetles are coming out and you're finding a lot of sawdust, this is quick acting. It has a penetrating agent solvent system, so you can inject it all around the tree safely. It will kill off active beetles effectively, and it's just real helpful for a tree, again, that's showing a lot of activity that you want to try and save. So this would be a supplemental thing, meaning that it's not really a solver of problems, but it can certainly be a band-aid and offer some quick kill, particularly if you're not comfortable with the liquid spray or feel like you're not getting good coverage into those gaps. Oftentimes with pine trees, you can kind of pull back the bark a little bit and you can find tons of sawdust and beetles active in there. And if you're not able to get the liquid spray in there, the aerosol can be a good tool for that purpose. So in summary, if you're treating for prevention, the Maxxthor, at the rate that we talked about earlier, the 2.5 ounces in 5 gallons of water is a great rate to use. And if you've got a problem, 1 ounce to a gallon of water is the recommended dose. Plan on treating at least twice a year for active problems. And if you're just doing prevention, once a year is fine. For active problems, you also want to treat systemically, and that would include at least a Prothor in the bucket, but adding the fertilizer and the fungicide would be a smart thing to do because you're able to get everything done. Remember, trees that have insects doing damage are so vulnerable to fungus and mold and other things that the fungicide can help control. Canker is a very big issue, but there are other funguses that can develop on trees, all of which can be controlled by the systemic fungicide that you see listed below this video. So in summary, if you've got some trees that you want to protect, or if you have some trees that have a wood boring pest and you want to try and save them, this procedure will get you well on the way of saving those trees and keeping the other ones healthy and happy as well. And it's not costly. It doesn't take a lot of time. Twice a year is plenty for active problems, once a year for prevention. And in the long run, you can keep the trees that you have without worrying about whether or not they're going to be attacked by something that's going on in a neighbor's yard, or say some properties that are national forests or other areas close to your property that are being devastated. Right now around this country, we're seeing massive destruction of trees in all different regions by many, many different species. The good news is that you can take control of any potential problem, and the prevention methods that I've detailed here will help save trees and keep yours very happy and healthy before you have to think about cutting any of them down. So thank you for watching this how-to video from Bugspray.com.